The coffee pot shattered against the floor of the Rising Sun Saloon, its dark contents pooling at Ruby Ellis's feet like the remnants of her dignity. She'd spilled enough coffee in her first week to flood the entire town of Oroville, California, or so Mr. Higgins, the saloon owner, liked to remind her. But Ruby had nowhere else to go, not since her father's farm had been seized by the bank 3 weeks after his funeral. "Clean that up before customers arrive, girl," Higgins barked, barely looking up from counting the previous night's earnings. Ruby nodded silently, dropping to her knees with a rag. At 22, she'd imagined a different life for herself than serving whiskey to miners and drifters in a dusty saloon in 1876. Back in Philadelphia, she'd been a schoolteacher's assistant, respectable and educated. Now, she was just another saloon girl, whispered about by the church ladies who crossed the street rather than share a sidewalk with her. "And try not to break anything else," Higgins added. "I'm not made of money or crockery." The saloon doors swung open, letting in a sliver of the harsh June sunlight and a tall figure who seemed to block it all out. Ruby squinted up from her position on the floor. "We're not open yet," Higgins called. "Come back at noon." The stranger ignored him, staggering forward 2 steps before collapsing face down onto the freshly swept floorboards. Ruby gasped, dropping her rag and rushing to the fallen man. He was dressed in trail-worn clothes, dust covering every inch of him from his boots to his wide-brimmed hat that had tumbled off, revealing matted brown hair. "Mr. Higgins, he's hurt," Ruby called, turning the stranger onto his back. His face was sunburned and cracked, lips parched to splitting. When his eyes fluttered open, they were the color of the sky just before a storm, gray-blue and unfocused. "Water," he croaked. Ruby ran behind the bar, filling a clean glass with water from the barrel they kept for coffee. Kneeling beside the stranger, she gently lifted his head and held the glass to his lips. "Slowly," she instructed. "Small sips." Higgins hovered nearby, frowning. "Is he dying?" "I don't need a corpse in my establishment, Miss Ellis." "He's not dying," Ruby replied, though she couldn't be certain. The man looked as if he'd ridden through hell itself. "He needs rest and fluids. Help me get him to a chair." Together, they managed to drag the half-conscious stranger to a chair. Up close, Ruby could see he was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps late 20s, with a strong jawline currently obscured by a week's growth of beard. "What's your name, mister?" Higgins demanded. "Bryce," the man whispered. "Bryce Quinn." "Well, Mr. Quinn," Higgins said, "the doctor's office is 3 doors down. This is a saloon, not an infirmary." Ruby shot her employer a reproachful look. "Mr. Higgins, he can barely stand." "Not my problem," Higgins replied, but his voice lacked conviction. The stranger Bryce looked up at Ruby with those storm cloud eyes. "Coffee," he murmured. "Just need coffee." Ruby nodded, returning to the bar to prepare a fresh pot on the stove. As she worked, she kept glancing at the mysterious cowboy. His shoulders were broad beneath his dusty denim jacket, his hands calloused but clean of the dirt that suggested mining. A cattleman, perhaps, or maybe a drifter. By the time the coffee was ready, Bryce Quinn had regained some of his color. Ruby poured him a steaming cup and brought it over, along with a plate of yesterday's biscuits she'd warmed on the stove. "Thank you, miss," he said, his voice stronger now. He took a long sip, closing his eyes as if the bitter brew was the finest whiskey. "Best damn coffee I've ever tasted." Ruby couldn't help but smile. "I doubt that very much, Mr. Quinn. I've only been making coffee for a week." "Then you're a natural." He looked at her directly now, his gaze clearer. "I rode 3 days straight from Sacramento. No sleep, barely any water, my horse." His expression clouded. "Your horse," Ruby prompted. collapsed about a mile outside town, had to leave him. Bryce's hands tightened around the mug. Some men are following me. Bad men. Higgins, who had been pretending not to eavesdrop, stepped closer. What kind of trouble are you bringing to my saloon, Quinn? The kind that won't find me if I can rest up a bit, Bryce replied. I have money. I'll pay for the coffee, a meal, and your trouble. You'll pay for a room at the hotel and be on your way, Higgins countered. Ruby intervened. Mr. Higgins, we have that storage room upstairs. It's no bigger than a closet, but there's space for a pallet. He could rest there until he's stronger. And why would I allow that? Higgins demanded. Because, Ruby said, thinking quickly, if these men are looking for him, they'll likely come here to ask questions. And when they do, they'll buy drinks. Higgins considered this, his merchant's mind calculating the potential profit. One night, he finally agreed. And you'll be responsible for him, Miss Ellis. Ruby nodded, ignoring the flutter in her stomach at the prospect. I'll get the room ready. As Higgins walked away, Bryce caught Ruby's wrist gently. Why help a stranger? Ruby glanced down at his hand on hers, then met his eyes. Everyone deserves a little kindness, Mr. Quinn, even in a place like this. Especially in a place like this, he corrected, a hint of a smile touching his cracked lips. And it's Bryce, please. Ruby, she offered in return. Ruby Ellis. Well, Ruby Ellis, he said, releasing her wrist and lifting his coffee cup in a toast. You may have just saved my life with this coffee. The makeshift room that Ruby prepared for Bryce was little more than a glorified closet, as she'd warned just enough space for a pallet on the floor, a small table, and a wash basin. Still, it was private and had a window overlooking the back alley, providing both light and a potential escape route if needed. By late afternoon, the rising sun had filled with its usual crowd, miners fresh from their claims, a few cattle hands from nearby ranches, and the occasional traveler passing through Oroville. Ruby moved among them, serving drinks and deflecting wandering hands with practiced ease. All the while, she kept glancing toward the stairs, wondering about the mysterious man resting above. Ruby, Higgins called from behind the bar. Table 3 needs whiskey, and Mrs. Winters is asking for you. Ruby suppressed a groan. Henrietta Winters was the bank manager's wife, and the self-appointed moral guardian of Oroville. Her visits to the saloon were never pleasant. As expected, Mrs. Winters sat primly at a corner table, her face pinched with disapproval. She was accompanied by 2 other ladies from the Oroville Ladies' Auxiliary Society, all 3 looking as if they'd been forced to enter a den of iniquity. Miss Ellis, Mrs. Winters greeted coldly as Ruby approached. Mrs. Winters, Ruby replied, keeping her voice neutral. What can I get for you ladies? Information, Mrs. Winters replied. My husband saw you helping a stranger into the saloon this morning, a rough-looking man. Is he staying here? Ruby hesitated, instantly wary. A customer took ill. Mr. Higgins allowed him to rest upstairs. Mrs. Winters exchanged knowing glances with her companions. How charitable of Mr. Higgins, she said, her tone suggesting it was anything but. And of you to tend to this customer so diligently. It was the Christian thing to do, Ruby replied, forcing a smile. Christian, Mrs. Winters practically spat the word. I hardly think you're in a position to lecture on Christian values, Miss Ellis. A respectable woman wouldn't be caught dead working in an establishment like this, let alone consorting with the type of men who frequent it. Ruby's cheeks burned. I serve coffee and meals, Mrs. Winters, nothing more, and I'm not ashamed of honest work. Honest? One of the other women scoffed. Is that what they're calling it these days, ladies? Ruby said, her patience wearing thin. Unless you're ordering drinks, I have paying customers to attend to. As she turned to leave, Mrs. Winters called after her. Your poor father would be heartbroken to see what's become of his daughter." Ruby froze, her father's face flashing before her eyes, kind, proud, and so very disappointed when she'd been unable to save their farm. She spun back around, ready to defend herself, when a deep voice spoke from behind her. "Excuse me, ladies. I couldn't help overhearing." Bryce Quinn stood there, still looking trail-worn but considerably more alert than he had that morning. He'd clearly made use of the wash-basin Ruby had provided. His face was clean-shaven now, revealing a strong jaw and the hint of a dimple in his right cheek. "I want to personally thank Miss Ellis," he continued, his voice carrying enough for nearby tables to hear. "I rode too hard in this heat and collapsed right through those doors this morning. This young lady not only provided medical attention but also the best cup of coffee I've had in years. You might say she saved my life, pouring that coffee. Mrs. Winters looked startled, her eyes darting between Ruby and Bryce. "And you are Bryce Quinn, madam, cattle buyer from Sacramento." He tipped his hat, the picture of Western courtesy. "And I must say, Oroville is lucky to have such a kind-hearted young woman in its midst. Why, in some towns, they might have left a stranger to suffer." The ladies from the auxiliary society shifted uncomfortably. Being unkind to strangers was decidedly unchristian. "Well," Mrs. Winters said finally, gathering her purse, "we should be going. Good day, Mr. Quinn." She didn't acknowledge Ruby as they filed out. When they were gone, Ruby turned to Bryce. "Thank you, but you shouldn't be up yet. You were half dead this morning." "I've been worse," he replied with a slight smile. "And I couldn't let those vultures peck at you when you've been nothing but kind to me." Ruby glanced around the saloon, aware that several customers were watching their exchange with interest. "You should eat something. I'll bring you a plate." In the kitchen, Ruby tried to steady her hands as she prepared a plate of stew and biscuits. Bryce Quinn was dangerous not because of whatever trouble followed him, but because of how easily he'd stepped to her defense, how naturally he'd smiled at her. Men like him didn't stay in one place long enough for anything to take root. When she returned with his meal, she found Bryce seated at a small table in the corner, his back to the wall and his eyes on the door, the position of a man who expected trouble. "Your food," she said, setting down the plate. "Join me," he asked, gesturing to the empty chair. Ruby glanced at Higgins, who was busy with customers at the bar. "Just for a minute." As Bryce ate, Ruby studied him. In the lamplight, she could see faint lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under the sun and a small scar near his temple that disappeared into his hairline. "So," she began, keeping her voice low, "cattle buyer." Bryce paused, a spoonful of stew halfway to his mouth. "Is that what I said?" To Mrs. Winters, yes. He set down his spoon. It seemed more respectable than man on the run. "And what are you running from, Mr. Quinn?" "It's not so much what as who," he replied, his eyes meeting hers. "And the less you know, the safer you'll be." "That's not very reassuring." "It wasn't meant to be." He resumed eating. "This is good. You cook it?" "Yes," Ruby admitted. "Mr. Higgins hired me primarily as a cook, though I serve drinks too." "How long have you worked here?" 3 weeks, Ruby said, fidgeting with her apron. "Since my father died and we lost our farm outside town. No one else would hire a single woman without references or family." Bryce nodded, understanding in his eyes. "People are quick to judge what they don't understand." Like those ladies, he confirmed. "Though I've met their kind in every town from here to Texas. They comfort themselves by standing on the necks of others." Ruby was surprised by the insight. "You've traveled far, farther than I care to remember sometimes." There was a weariness in his voice that suggested his journeys hadn't all been by choice. Before Ruby could ask more, the saloon doors burst open, and 3 men entered. The conversation in the room dimmed as everyone turned to look at the newcomers. They were dusty from the trail, with hard eyes that scanned the room methodically. The leader, a tall man with a shock of white blonde hair, had a badge pinned to his vest. Bryce stiffened. "Don't look at them," he murmured to Ruby. "Get up slowly and go to the bar. Tell Higgins those men are trouble." Ruby wanted to protest, to ask questions, but the urgency in Bryce's voice brooked no argument. She stood casually, as if she'd simply finished a conversation with a customer and made her way to Higgins. "Those men who just came in," she whispered. "Mr. Quinn says they're trouble." Higgins glanced at the newcomers, then at Bryce, who was now hunched over his meal, face partially hidden. "What kind of trouble?" "I don't know, but they're looking for him." "Damn it," Higgins muttered. "I knew that drifter would bring problems. If they start anything, I'm throwing him out myself." The leader of the group approached the bar. Up close, Ruby could see his badge more clearly. U.S. Marshal. "Evening," the marshal said. "I'm looking for a man, brown hair, about 6 foot, riding a chestnut gelding. Name's Bryce Quinn." Higgins immediately pointed toward Bryce's corner. "That's him right there, Marshal. Showed up this morning half dead from the trail." Ruby's heart sank at Higgins's betrayal, though she shouldn't have expected anything else. Self-preservation was the saloon owner's only real loyalty. The marshal nodded his thanks and motioned for his deputies to follow. They surrounded Bryce's table, hands hovering near their holsters. "Bryce Quinn," the marshal said loudly, "you're wanted for questioning regarding the robbery of the Sacramento Bank and Trust. Stand up slowly." Ruby gasped. A bank robber. She'd given shelter to a bank robber. Bryce sighed, setting down his spoon and raising his hands. "Marshal Blackwood," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Fancy meeting you in Oroville." "Stand up," the marshal repeated. "Hands where I can see them." Bryce complied, rising slowly. "I didn't rob any bank, and you know it." "Tell it to the judge," Blackwood replied, nodding to one of his deputies who stepped forward with handcuffs. "You were seen fleeing the scene." "I was leaving town because I knew you'd pin it on me," Bryce said. His eyes briefly found Ruby's across the room, and she saw regret there. "Just like the last time," the marshal smirked. "Quite a coincidence how trouble follows you, Quinn." "Quite," Bryce agreed dryly. As the deputy moved to cuff him, Bryce suddenly grabbed the man's arm, twisting it and using him as a shield. In the same motion, he drew a hidden pistol from his boot. "Nobody move," he shouted. The saloon erupted in chaos. Customers dove under tables or scrambled for the doors. Higgins cursed loudly. The marshal and his remaining deputy drew their weapons, creating a standoff. "Put down your gun, Quinn," Marshal Blackwood ordered. "You're only making it worse." "Can't do that, Marshal," Bryce replied. "Not when you're framing me for a crime I didn't commit." Ruby stood frozen behind the bar, her heart pounding. She should run, hide, scream, anything but watch this unfold. Yet she couldn't tear her eyes away from Bryce, from the desperate determination in his face. "Everyone calm down," Higgins pleaded, raising his hands. "No shooting in my establishment." The tension in the room was palpable, like the air before a lightning strike. Ruby knew someone would make a move soon, and blood would spill on the saloon floor. Without thinking, she grabbed a bottle of whiskey and threw it toward the ceiling lantern over the marshal's head. Glass shattered, oil spilled, and flames erupted instantly. The distraction worked. Everyone looked up, and in that moment, Bryce shoved his hostage toward the marshal and bolted for the kitchen door. "Fire!" someone yelled, and the remaining customers stampeded for the exits. Ruby didn't hesitate. She ran after Bryce, ignoring Higgins's shouts and the marshal's threats. Behind her, she heard Blackwood organizing his men to pursue, but the fire was spreading quickly along the oil-soaked bar, buying them precious seconds. In the alley behind the saloon, Bryce was already mounting a horse one she recognized as belonging to a regular customer who always tied his mount at the back door. "Ruby," he called when he saw her. "What are you doing? Get back inside." "You're stealing Mr. Peterson's horse," she said, absurdly focusing on this detail rather than the life-altering decision she was making. "I'll return it," Bryce replied, extending his hand. "Come with me." "What? I can't. You just aided a fugitive," he pointed out. "Set fire to a saloon. How do you think that's going to play with Marshal Blackwood? Or Mrs. Winters?" Ruby hesitated, hearing shouts from inside the building. The fire would be controlled quickly. The saloon kept buckets of water for just such emergencies, but her actions wouldn't be forgotten or forgiven. "I'm not a bank robber," Bryce said, his hand still outstretched. "I swear it. But we don't have time for explanations now." Ruby took his hand and let him pull her up behind him on the horse. It was madness, complete madness, but she wrapped her arms around his waist as he spurred the horse into a gallop, leaving Oroville and her brief, troubled life there behind. They rode hard through the night, keeping to back trails and avoiding the main roads. Bryce seemed to know the terrain well, guiding the horse through dense woodland and across shallow streams that would hide their tracks. Ruby clung to him, her mind racing with questions and fears. What had she done? She'd thrown away what little security she had, aided a fugitive, and was now fleeing with a man she barely knew. Her father would indeed be heartbroken, not because she'd worked in a saloon, but because she'd abandoned all sense and reason. When the horse began to tire, Bryce guided them to a small clearing near a creek. The moon was high, providing just enough light to make out shapes in the darkness. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said, dismounting and helping her down. "The horse needs water and rest." Ruby's legs felt like jelly after hours of riding. She stumbled slightly and Bryce caught her arms to steady her. "You okay?" he asked, his face half shadowed in the moonlight. "No," she replied honestly. "I'm not okay. I just left everything behind to flee with a man wanted for bank robbery." "A man I met this morning." Bryce released her and moved to tend to the horse. "I didn't ask you to come." "You literally held out your hand and said, 'Come with me,'" Ruby retorted. "After you set fire to a saloon to help me escape," he pointed out. Ruby had no response to that. He was right. She'd made her choice the moment she threw that bottle. But now, in the quiet darkness of the woods, reality was setting in. "Are you a bank robber?" she asked finally. Bryce finished watering the horse before answering. He sat down on a fallen log and gestured for her to join him. After a moment's hesitation, she did. "No," he said. "I'm not. I was a cavalry scout during the war, then a bounty hunter, and for the last year I've been working as a private investigator for the Pinkerton Agency." Ruby blinked in surprise. "A detective?" "Yes. I was in Sacramento investigating a series of bank robberies. The local marshals were getting nowhere, so the banks hired Pinkertons." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. "I was getting close, too close. Marshal Blackwood and his men showed up at my hotel room the night before the Sacramento bank was hit, tried to arrest me on trumped-up charges. I escaped out the back. And the next day the bank was robbed," Ruby finished, beginning to understand. "And because you fled town." "I was the perfect suspect," Bryce confirmed. "Blackwood made sure witnesses saw me near the bank that morning." "But why would a U.S. Marshal frame you?" Bryce's laugh was bitter. "Because he's not a real marshal. The badge is as fake as his righteousness. His real name is Elias Donovan, and he leads the gang that's been hitting banks across Northern California. They pose as lawmen investigating their own robberies. It's brilliant, really." Ruby tried to process this. "Do you have proof?" "I had evidence in my hotel room documents, witness statements, bank records showing suspicious transactions to Blackwood's real name, but he has it all now. Bryce looked at her directly. That's why I came to Oroville. There's a federal judge here, Judge Wilson. He's honest, and I've worked with him before. I was planning to explain everything, get him to telegraph the real federal authorities in San Francisco. Why didn't you just go straight to the judge when you arrived? Bryce gestured to himself. Look at me. I rode for 3 days straight, barely slept, my horse died. I was in no condition to convince a federal judge of a conspiracy. I needed rest, time to gather my thoughts. He sighed. I didn't count on Blackwood finding me so quickly or on involving an innocent woman in my troubles. Ruby considered his story. It was fantastical, the stuff of dime novels, yet there had been something wrong about Marshal Blackwood, a coldness in his eyes that didn't match his supposed position of justice. I believe you, she said finally. Bryce looked surprised. Just like that. You had plenty of chances to harm me if you were truly a criminal, Ruby reasoned, and that marshal seemed wrong somehow. Your instincts are good, Bryce said with a small smile. Blackwood Donovan is a predator. He enjoys the power his false badge gives him. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the soft nickering of the horse and the gentle burble of the creek. What now? Ruby asked eventually. We circle back to Oroville tomorrow, but carefully. Judge Wilson's home is on the north edge of town. We'll approach at dusk when Blackwood and his men are likely watching the roads and saloons. Bryce looked at her seriously. But I understand if you want to part ways. You could make your way to the next town, start fresh. What I'm doing is dangerous. Ruby considered the option. She could leave now, find another small town, perhaps another saloon job. Start over again alone. No, she decided. I've come this far, and if what you're saying is true, then Blackwood needs to be stopped. Relief crossed Bryce's features. Thank you. I won't forget this, Ruby. See that you don't, she replied, trying to sound braver than she felt. Now, is there any chance of food? I'm starving. Bryce chuckled, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. I grabbed my saddlebags before we fled. There's jerky and hardtack, not exactly a feast, but it'll keep us going. They shared the meager meal, taking turns drinking from Bryce's canteen. As they ate, Ruby studied him in the moonlight. There was a steadiness to him, a quiet confidence that came from a life of self-reliance. Despite the danger they were in, she felt safe in his presence. We should get some sleep, Bryce said when they'd finished eating. I'll take first watch. First watch? You haven't slept properly in days. All the more reason to stay alert, he replied. I'm used to it, you sleep. I'll wake you in a few hours. Ruby wanted to argue but found herself yawning instead. The events of the day had left her mentally and physically exhausted. Bryce handed her his coat to use as a pillow, and she curled up on the soft ground near the base of a large pine. Ruby, Bryce said softly as she settled. Thank you. Not just for believing me, but for that coffee this morning. I meant what I said to those ladies. You did save my life. Ruby smiled into the darkness. It was just coffee. Sometimes, he replied. That's all it takes. As she drifted towards sleep, Ruby wondered at the strange turn her life had taken. Yesterday, she'd been a saloon girl, looked down upon by the respectable women of Oroville. Today, she was a fugitive, fleeing with a handsome detective across the California wilderness. Her father had always told her that life had a way of surprising you when you least expected it. For the first time since his death, Ruby felt something stirring in her chest that wasn't grief, something that felt suspiciously like hope. Dawn broke with a chorus of birdsong and the soft rustling of leaves in the morning breeze. Ruby awoke to find Bryce crouched by a small, carefully constructed fire, heating water in a tin cup. "You're making coffee?" she asked, sitting up and rubbing sleep from her eyes. "Trying to," he replied with a rueful smile, "though I doubt it'll match yours. I found some grounds in my saddlebag." Ruby stretched and moved to join him by the fire. "You were supposed to wake me for my watch." "You needed the sleep more than I needed it," Bryce said, handing her the cup once the water had boiled. "Besides, I'm used to long nights." As they shared the makeshift coffee and the last of the jerky, Bryce outlined his plan. They would skirt Oroville to the east, using the foothills for cover, then approach Judge Wilson's home from the north after sunset. "Won't Blackwood have men watching the judge's house?" Ruby asked. "Probably, but not as many as he'll have on the roads and in town. And they'll be looking for a man alone, not a couple." Bryce glanced at her appraisingly. "We'll need to disguise ourselves somewhat. Your dress is too recognizable." Ruby looked down at her blue saloon dress, now dusty and wrinkled from their flight. "I don't exactly have a change of clothes." "There's a small homestead about 2 miles north of here," Bryce said. "I passed it on my way to Oroville. They had washing on the line a woman and what looked like a man about my size." "You want us to steal clothes?" Ruby asked, raising her eyebrows. "Borrow," Bryce corrected. "I'll leave money." "More than the clothes are worth." Ruby wasn't entirely comfortable with the plan, but she had to admit it made sense. "Fine, but I choose which dress to take. I won't have some poor woman losing her best Sunday outfit." They reached the homestead mid-morning. As Bryce had predicted, washing hung on a line behind the small cabin shirts, trousers, and a few simple dresses. The place appeared empty, its occupants likely working their fields or perhaps gone to town. While Bryce kept watch, Ruby quickly selected a plain brown dress that appeared well worn but serviceable. For Bryce, she grabbed a faded blue shirt and dark trousers that looked close to his size. True to his word, Bryce left several coins wrapped in a handkerchief on the porch steps, far more than the clothes were worth. They changed separately, each giving the other privacy behind the cover of trees. When Ruby emerged in her new attire, she felt strangely exposed despite being more fully covered than in her saloon dress. The homesteader's dress was simple cotton, with long sleeves and a high collar, the garb of a respectable farm wife. Bryce, too, looked transformed in the borrowed clothes. Without his trail dust and with his hair combed back with water from the creek, he could pass for a local rancher or tradesman. "We'll need a story," Ruby said as they resumed their journey, keeping to the tree line and avoiding the main trails. "If anyone stops us." "Husband and wife," Bryce suggested, "traveling to visit family in Oroville." Ruby felt her cheeks warm at the word husband but nodded agreement. "Where are we from?" "Marysville," Bryce decided. "It's close enough to be believable but far enough that no one would expect to know us." They spent the next few hours refining their cover story as they traveled. They'd been married 2 years, had no children yet, and were visiting Ruby's fictional aunt who was ailing. Bryce worked as a blacksmith's assistant, and Ruby took in sewing. It felt strange to Ruby, constructing this imaginary life with a man she barely knew. Stranger still was how natural it seemed, how easily they fell into the rhythm of it. By afternoon, they were finishing each other's sentences and laughing at small embellishments they added to their tale. "You realize," Ruby said as they paused to rest in the shade of an oak, "that we know almost nothing real about each other, yet we've created an entire false life together." Bryce smiled, passing her the canteen. "Sometimes it's easier to be someone else." "Is that why you became a detective?" "To be someone else," his smile faded slightly. "No, I became a detective because I'm good at reading people, at seeing the truth behind their lies. After the war, it seemed like a useful skill." "The war," Ruby echoed. "You said you were a cavalry scout." Bryce nodded. "For the Union." "Spent most of my time in Tennessee and Georgia, moving ahead of the main forces, gathering intelligence. "You must have seen terrible things," Ruby said softly. "Yes," he replied simply, "but I also saw remarkable courage and kindness in the midst of all that horror." It changes how you see the world. Ruby thought about that. "Is that why you're not afraid of Blackwood? Because you've seen worse?" "I'm afraid of Blackwood," Bryce admitted. "Only a fool wouldn't be, but I've learned that fear is just information. It tells you where the danger is, nothing more. What matters is what you do with that information." Ruby considered his words. "My father used to say something similar. He said courage isn't the absence of fear, it's feeling the fear and doing what's right anyway." "Sounds like a wise man," Bryce said. "You mentioned he had a farm." Ruby nodded, a familiar sadness washing over her. "Just outside Oroville, 20 acres, mostly wheat. He came west after my mother died, wanted to start fresh. I was 16 then." "And now?" "22, Ruby replied. "We did well for a few years, but last winter was hard. Father took sick in February, pneumonia. By the time he passed, we were deep in debt. The bank foreclosed within weeks." Her voice turned bitter. "Mr. Winters, the same man whose wife came to shame me at the saloon, personally supervised as they took everything, down to my mother's china." Bryce's expression hardened. "I've seen plenty of men like Winters. They thrive on others' misfortunes. The worst part was that no one would hire me afterward," Ruby continued. "I can read and write, I can keep accounts, but the only position open to me was at the saloon. And once I took it, I became untouchable to decent folk." "Their loss," Bryce said with surprising vehemence. "You're the most decent person I've met in a long time." The sincerity in his voice made Ruby's heart flutter strangely. To hide her reaction, she stood and brushed off her borrowed dress. "We should keep moving. It'll be sunset soon." As they continued their journey, Ruby found herself studying Bryce when he wasn't looking. The way he moved with quiet confidence, the gentle way he handled their borrowed horse, the lines that appeared between his brows when he was thinking deeply. There was something compelling about him that went beyond his handsome features or his heroic story. By dusk, they had reached the northern outskirts of Oroville. From their vantage point in the hills, they could see the town spread out below them, the main street with its shops and saloons, the rising sun conspicuously dark, though it didn't appear to have burned completely. The church steeple rising above the other buildings, and the scattered homes on the town's periphery. "There," Bryce said, pointing to a large white house set apart from its neighbors. "That's Judge Wilson's place." Ruby squinted in the fading light. "It looks quiet, no obvious guards." "They'll be there," Bryce assured her. "Blackwood isn't careless." He turned to her, his expression serious. "This is your last chance to turn back, Ruby. Once we go down there, there's no changing your mind." Ruby straightened her shoulders. "I've already made my choice, Mr. Quinn. I'm seeing this through." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Back to Mr. Quinn now, is it?" "For now," she replied with a small smile of her own. "Until we're sure we both survive the night." They left the horse secured in a small grove of trees and made their final approach on foot as darkness fell. Bryce led them through backyards and gardens, keeping to the shadows and freezing at any sound of movement. As they neared the judge's property, Bryce pulled Ruby close behind a woodshed. "There," he whispered, indicating a shadow by the judge's back porch. "And there." Another figure was barely visible near the gate that led to the front yard. "How do we get past them?" Ruby asked, her voice a breath against his ear. "We don't need to get past all of them," Bryce replied. "Just create enough of a distraction to get inside and speak to the judge." He outlined his plan quickly. Ruby would approach the front of the house, claiming to be a neighbor with urgent news for the judge. While the guard at the front was occupied with her, Bryce would neutralize the man at the back and enter through the kitchen. What if there are more guards inside? Ruby asked. Then we improvise, Bryce said, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. Trust me. Ruby nodded, though her heart was pounding so hard she was sure it would give her away. Be careful, she whispered. You too, he replied, and before she could respond, he leaned forward and pressed a quick, gentle kiss to her forehead. For luck, he added softly. Then he was gone, moving silently through the shadows toward the back of the judge's house. Ruby took a deep breath, smoothed her borrowed dress, and walked purposefully toward the front gate. The guard stationed there straightened as she approached. In the dim light from the house's windows, she could see he was a young man, barely more than a boy, with a deputy's badge that caught the lamplight. Madam, he called uncertainly as Ruby reached the gate. This area is restricted. Ruby clutched at her chest dramatically. Oh, thank goodness. I need to see Judge Wilson immediately. It's an emergency. The young deputy stepped forward, one hand hovering near his holster. What kind of emergency, madam? It's Marshal Blackwood, Ruby said, dropping her voice to a frantic whisper. I overheard him at the hotel. He's planning something terrible. He said the judge knows too much, that he needs to be silenced. The deputy's eyes widened, and Ruby could see him struggling with this information. Who are you exactly? Sarah Johnson, Ruby invented wildly. I work at the hotel. Please, you must let me speak with the judge. The marshal said it would happen tonight. While the deputy hesitated, Ruby heard a muffled thud from the back of the house. Bryce had dealt with the other guard. She needed to keep this one distracted. Please, she begged, grabbing the deputy's arm. There's no time. Before he could respond, the front door of the house opened, and an older man with white hair and a neatly trimmed beard appeared. What's going on out here, Deputy Miller? The man, presumably Judge Wilson, called. The deputy turned toward the judge. This woman says Ruby never learned what the deputy was about to say, because at that moment, Bryce appeared from the shadows behind him and brought the butt of his pistol down on the young man's head. The deputy crumpled without a sound. Judge Wilson reached for something inside the doorway, likely a weapon, but Bryce quickly raised his hands. Judge Wilson, he called. My name is Bryce Quinn, Pinkerton Detective Agency. I need to speak with you urgently about Marshal Elias Blackwood, or as he's better known to his gang, Elias Donovan. The judge paused, his hand still inside the doorway. Quinn, the bank robber? No, sir, Bryce replied firmly. The detective who was framed by Blackwood, because I was getting too close to exposing his operation. Please, sir. I have information that proves he's behind the bank robberies across Northern California. Judge Wilson studied them for a long moment, his eyes moving from Bryce's earnest face to Ruby's anxious one, to the unconscious deputy at their feet. You have 2 minutes to convince me, he finally said, stepping back from the doorway. Then I decide whether to call the real authorities or shoot you myself. Ruby exchanged a glance with Bryce as they followed the judge inside. His expression was grim but determined. They'd gotten this far now, they just had to make Judge Wilson believe them. The judge's study was a wood-paneled room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a large desk. He gestured for them to sit in the chairs opposite him while he remained standing, a shotgun now visible in his hands. Talk, he ordered Bryce. For the next several minutes, Bryce laid out his investigation in clear, concise terms, how the Pinkerton Agency had been hired to look into the string of bank robberies, how he discovered a pattern that implicated law enforcement, and how he'd eventually identified Blackwood as Elias Donovan, a former Confederate guerrilla who had assembled a gang of men after the war. The real Marshal Andrews was found dead near Reading 6 months ago, Bryce explained. Blackwood took his identity and badge, Since then, he and his men have posed as federal marshals investigating the very crimes they commit. That's a serious accusation, Judge Wilson said, though Ruby noted he hadn't lowered the shotgun. Where's your proof? I had documentation in my hotel room in Sacramento bank records showing transfers to Donovan's real name, witness statements, descriptions that match Blackwood and his men. But they raided my room the night before the Sacramento bank robbery. They took everything. Convenient, the judge observed dryly. But verifiable, Bryce countered. If you telegraph the Pinkerton office in San Francisco, they'll confirm I'm their agent, and if you contact the real U.S. Marshal's office, they'll tell you there is no Marshal Blackwood authorized in this jurisdiction. Judge Wilson's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. How did you get involved in this? He asked Ruby. Ruby explained her role, from Bryce collapsing in the saloon to their escape the previous night. She didn't embellish or downplay her actions, she simply told the truth, including the part about setting fire to the rising sun. When she finished, the judge finally lowered his shotgun, though he kept it within reach. I must be getting soft in my old age, he said, because against my better judgment I believe you too. He sighed heavily. There have been rumors about Blackwood since he arrived in these parts. Things don't add up. And just yesterday, I received a letter from an old colleague in the Justice Department asking if I'd met the new marshal assigned to this region. There is no official record of a Marshal Blackwood being posted here. Relief washed over Ruby, and she saw Bryce's shoulders relax slightly. What now, Your Honor? Bryce asked. Now, the judge said, moving to a cabinet and retrieving a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses. We plan how to trap a wolf. He poured 3 fingers of amber liquid into each glass and handed them around. Blackwood Donovan is in town with at least 6 men. He's been telling everyone you're dangerous fugitives. Half the county is looking for you. We need proof, Bryce said, accepting the whiskey but not drinking. Something that will convince the authorities in Sacramento or San Francisco. What we need, Judge Wilson corrected, is to catch him in the act. He took a thoughtful sip of his drink. The Oroville Bank is hosting a gold shipment tomorrow night. It's being held in their vault until it can be transported to San Francisco on Friday. Bryce leaned forward, his eyes bright with interest. A tempting target. Too tempting to resist, I'd wager, the judge agreed. Especially with the town in disarray looking for fugitives. You think Blackwood will hit the bank tomorrow night, Ruby said, understanding dawning. I'd bet my gavel on it, Judge Wilson replied. And when he does, we'll be waiting. Over the next hour, they formulated a plan. Judge Wilson would telegraph the real U.S. Marshal's office in San Francisco, requesting immediate assistance. However, given the distance, they couldn't count on reinforcements arriving before Blackwood made his move. They would need to set a trap themselves. I have 4 deputies I trust implicitly, Judge Wilson said. Men who have served this county for years. With them, plus us 3, we might have enough manpower to capture Blackwood and his gang. It's risky, Bryce warned. These men are killers. They won't hesitate to shoot. Neither will I, the judge replied grimly. I've been a justice of the peace in this territory for 20 years. I won't let some Confederate bushwhacker make a mockery of the law on my watch. As they continued planning, Ruby found herself studying the interaction between Bryce and the judge. There was a mutual respect there, a shared understanding of justice that transcended their brief acquaintance. She realized that Bryce's world, this world of lawmen and detectives, operated on a code she was only beginning to comprehend. When they'd finalized their strategy, Judge Wilson insisted they stay the night in his home. My housekeeper is visiting her sister in Marysville, so the house is empty save for me. There's a guest room upstairs for the lady, and Mr. Quinn can take the sofa in my study. Ruby was grateful for the offer of a real bed, though she felt suddenly awkward at the prospect of separation from Bryce. In just over a day, she'd grown accustomed to his presence, his steadying influence. "Thank you, Your Honor," she said, rising from her chair. "If you'll excuse me, I should like to rest now." The judge showed her to a comfortable bedroom on the second floor, apologizing for the lack of feminine touches. "My wife passed 5 years ago," he explained. "I haven't changed much since then." Left alone, Ruby sank onto the edge of the bed, sudden exhaustion overwhelming her. The events of the past 2 days seemed dreamlike, her life at the saloon already a distant memory compared to the intensity of her flight with Bryce. A soft knock at the door roused her from her thoughts. When she opened it, Bryce stood there, his expression unreadable in the dim hallway. "I wanted to check that you're all right," he said quietly. "I'm fine," Ruby assured him. "Just tired." "Tomorrow will be dangerous," Bryce continued, his voice low. "The judge and I are planning to position you somewhere safe, away from the action." Ruby bristled slightly. "I've come this far. I won't hide while you risk your lives." "Ruby," Bryce sighed, running a hand through his hair. "These men won't hesitate to kill you. This isn't your fight." "You made it my fight when you collapsed in my saloon," she replied firmly. "Besides, I'm the only one Blackwood hasn't seen with you. I could be useful." Bryce studied her face, then nodded reluctantly. "We'll discuss it with the judge in the morning. For now, get some rest." He hesitated, then added softly, "Thank you, Ruby, for believing in me when you had no reason to." Before she could respond, he turned and headed back downstairs. Ruby closed the door slowly, her heart beating a rapid tattoo against her ribs. She was no longer certain if her fear was about the danger they faced tomorrow, or the growing feeling that, whatever happened, her life would never be the same again. Morning brought a flurry of activity to Judge Wilson's home. The judge's trusted deputies arrived early, grim-faced men who listened intently as he explained the situation. Ruby watched from the kitchen doorway as Bryce showed them diagrams of the bank layout, pointing out positions and escape routes. "Miss Ellis," the judge called, beckoning her into the room. "Mr. Quinn tells me you're insisting on participating in tonight's operation." The deputies turned to look at her, their expressions ranging from skepticism to outright disapproval. Ruby lifted her chin. "I am, Your Honor." "It's dangerous work," one of the older deputies said. "No place for a lady." "With all due respect," Ruby replied, "I stopped being treated like a lady the moment I took work at the Rising Sun. I've had drunk miners threaten me, respectable women shun me, and now a false marshal hunt me. I believe I can handle myself." Bryce suppressed a smile, and Judge Wilson raised his eyebrows. "Well said, Miss Ellis, and as it happens, I think you might be useful to our plan." He turned to the deputies. "Blackwood hasn't seen Miss Ellis with Mr. Quinn. She's unknown to him, a potential advantage." The plan they devised was daring in its simplicity. Ruby would position herself near the bank in the early evening, posing as a woman waiting for her husband. She would watch for Blackwood and his men, sending a signal when they approached. Bryce, the judge, and the deputies would be hidden in and around the bank, ready to trap the gang once they entered. "What if Blackwood recognizes me from the saloon?" Ruby asked. "Unlikely," Judge Wilson replied. "From what you've told us, he was focused entirely on Mr. Quinn when he entered the Rising Sun. And in different clothes, with your hair styled differently, you should be sufficiently disguised." The judge's housekeeper had left behind some clothing that, with minor adjustments, fit Ruby well enough, a modest navy blue dress with a matching bonnet that partially obscured her face. With her hair pinned up differently, and a pair of spectacles borrowed from the judge's late wife. She looked nothing like the saloon girl who had fled Oroville 2 nights ago. As the day progressed, tension built in the house. The deputies came and went, making preparations while avoiding attention. Judge Wilson sent telegrams to San Francisco and Sacramento, alerting authorities to the situation, but making it clear they couldn't wait for reinforcements. By late afternoon, they were ready. Bryce found Ruby in the kitchen, where she was helping prepare a light meal for everyone before they set out. "You don't have to do this," he said quietly, leaning against the doorframe. "The judge has offered to arrange safe passage for you to San Francisco if you'd prefer." Ruby continued slicing bread, not looking up. "I'm not leaving, Bryce. I've made my decision." He moved closer, gently taking the knife from her hand and setting it down. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why risk your life for this for me?" Ruby finally met his gaze. "Because for the first time since my father died, I feel like I'm doing something that matters, not just surviving but standing for something right." She took a breath. "And because I trust you, I believe in what you're doing." Bryce's expression softened and his hand moved to touch her cheek briefly. "Be careful tonight. If anything happens, if you sense any danger, you run. Do you understand? No heroics." "The same goes for you," Ruby replied. "I didn't help you escape Blackwood once just to watch you die playing hero." A smile tugged at his lips. "Yes, madam." The moment was interrupted by Judge Wilson entering the kitchen. If he noticed their proximity or the charged atmosphere between them, he gave no indication. "It's time," he said simply. Dusk settled over Oroville like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an unusual quiet. Word of fugitives in the area had spread, and many townspeople had decided to stay home rather than risk encountering dangerous criminals. The streets were sparsely populated as Ruby took up her position on a bench across from the bank, a handkerchief in her lap that would serve as her signal when raised. From her vantage point, she could see the bank's entrance clearly. Inside, she knew, Bryce and 2 deputies were hidden, while Judge Wilson and the other deputies were positioned in buildings on either side of the bank. The trap was set now, they only needed the prey to appear. The wait was excruciating. Every passing figure made Ruby's heart leap. Every distant hoofbeat set her nerves on edge. She tried to appear casual, occasionally glancing at the small watch pinned to her dress as if waiting impatiently for someone. An hour passed, then another. Night fully descended, the streets lit now only by occasional lanterns and the moon above. Ruby began to worry. What if Blackwood had changed his plans? What if he'd somehow discovered their trap? Just as doubt was taking hold, she spotted them 4 men approaching from the direction of the hotel, moving with purpose. Even at a distance, she recognized Blackwood's distinctive blonde hair. They wore no badges now, and their faces were partially covered by bandanas pulled up to just below their eyes. Ruby's heart pounded. She waited until they were halfway to the bank before casually raising her handkerchief to dab at her face the signal. Almost immediately, she saw movement in the shadows around the bank, the deputies taking up their positions. Now came the most dangerous part, letting Blackwood and his men enter the bank before springing the trap. The 4 men paused about 20 yards from the bank, and to Ruby's horror, Blackwood turned to look directly at her. She quickly lowered her eyes to her lap, praying he wouldn't recognize her. After what felt like an eternity, the men continued toward the bank. Ruby allowed herself a small breath of relief. Then everything went wrong. Just as Blackwood and his men reached the bank steps, 2 more figures emerged from an alleyway behind them, more of Blackwood's gang, apparently positioned as lookouts. One of them pointed directly at Ruby. "Boss. That woman, she's signaling someone," Blackwood whirled, his hand going to his gun. Ruby stood, dropping all pretense, and ran. Gunfire erupted behind her as she fled down the street. She heard shouts, more shots, the sound of breaking glass. The trap had been sprung prematurely, and now chaos reigned. Ruby darted into an alley, her heart hammering against her ribs. The borrowed dress hampered her movements, and she hitched it up shamelessly as she ran. Behind her, she heard heavy footsteps in pursuit. "The girl! Get the girl!" Blackwood's voice commanded. Ruby emerged from the alley onto a side street, desperately searching for somewhere to hide. The livery stable loomed ahead, its large doors standing partially open. Without hesitation, she sprinted toward it. Inside, the stable was dim and filled with the smell of hay and horses. Ruby moved quickly past the stalls, searching for a hiding place. Behind her, she heard her pursuers enter the stable. "Check everywhere," a gruff voice ordered. "She's in here somewhere." Ruby ducked into an empty stall and pressed herself into the corner, covering her mouth to stifle her labored breathing. She could hear the men moving methodically through the stable, checking each stall. They were getting closer. 3 stalls away, 2. The next one would be hers. Suddenly, gunfire erupted outside the stable, loud, insistent. Her pursuers paused. "What the hell?" one muttered. "Donovan needs us," another said. "The girl can wait." Ruby heard them retreating, running back toward the bank. She remained frozen in her hiding place, unsure whether to feel relieved or more terrified. The gunfire outside continued, punctuated by shouts and the occasional scream. People were dying out there. Bryce could be among them. The thought galvanized her. She couldn't hide while others fought. Carefully, Ruby emerged from the stall and made her way to the stable doors, peering out cautiously. The scene on the street was chaos. Gunfire flashed from windows and doorways. She could see several bodies lying motionless in the dirt. Near the bank, a group of men were engaged in a firefight with others positioned in surrounding buildings. Ruby scanned the scene desperately, searching for any sign of Bryce or Judge Wilson. She couldn't tell who was winning, who was even on which side in the darkness and confusion. A movement to her left caught her attention, a man staggering away from the main battle, clutching his side. Even in the dim light, she recognized Blackwood's distinctive silhouette. He was wounded and fleeing. Without thinking of the danger, Ruby followed, keeping to the shadows. If Blackwood escaped, all of this would be for nothing. Bryce would remain a fugitive, the real criminals unpunished. Blackwood stumbled into an alley between 2 buildings. Ruby followed at a distance, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure he would hear it. At the end of the alley was a small yard behind what appeared to be a feed store. Blackwood collapsed against a stack of crates, breathing heavily. Ruby hesitated in the shadows, unsure what to do next. She had no weapon, no way to apprehend him. Following him had been instinct, not a plan. Before she could decide on a course of action, a voice spoke from nearby. "It's over, Donovan." Bryce stepped into the yard from another approach, his pistol trained on Blackwood. In the moonlight, Ruby could see blood on his sleeve, but he stood steady. Blackwood laughed a harsh, bitter sound. "Quinn, should have known you'd be like a bad penny." "Drop your gun," Bryce ordered. Instead, Blackwood raised his weapon with startling speed. Ruby screamed a warning, and in the same instant, 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Blackwood crumpled to the ground. Bryce staggered back a step but remained standing. "Bryce!" Ruby rushed forward, no longer concerned with hiding. He turned to her, surprise evident even in the darkness. "Ruby, what are you doing here, following him?" she said, gesturing to Blackwood's still form. "Are you hit?" Bryce glanced down at his shoulder where fresh blood was spreading. "Grazed, I'll live." He moved to Blackwood, kneeling to check for a pulse. After a moment, he sighed. He's dead. Ruby felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the immediate danger was over, regret that a life had ended, fear for what would happen next. "The others?" she asked. "Most are captured or dead," Bryce replied, rising to his feet with a slight wince. "Judge Wilson is coordinating with townspeople to secure the prisoners. The real U.S. Marshal should arrive from Sacramento by morning." He holstered his pistol and moved to Ruby, his expression softening as he reached her. Without a word, he pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly against his chest. "You were supposed to run if there was danger," he murmured into her hair. "So were you," she replied, her voice muffled against his shirt. They stood like that for a long moment, the adrenaline of the night gradually ebbing away, replaced by a profound relief and something deeper, something neither was ready to name. Finally, Bryce released her, though he kept hold of her hand. "Come on," he said. "Let's find Judge Wilson and end this once and for all." The aftermath of what would later be called the Oroville Bank battle kept the town in an uproar for days. The arrival of the real U.S. Marshal from Sacramento brought legitimacy to Bryce's claims. And as Blackwood's surviving gang members were interrogated, the full extent of their operation came to light. Elias Donovan had indeed been a former Confederate guerrilla who had turned to bank robbery after the war. He and his men had stolen over $50,000 from banks across Northern California, killing at least 7 people in the process. The real Marshal Andrews had been one of their victims, murdered so Blackwood could assume his identity. For Ruby, the days following the shootout passed in a blur of statements and testimonies. She told her story countless times to the marshal, to a circuit judge who arrived to process the prisoners, to townsfolk eager for details of the excitement. To her surprise, the town's attitude toward her shifted dramatically. The same people who had shunned her as a saloon girl now praised her courage. Mrs. Winters herself approached Ruby on the street to apologize for her hasty judgments. Ruby accepted these overtures with grace, but without illusion. She knew how quickly public opinion could change again. Through it all, Bryce remained by her side. His wound had been treated by the town doctor, a clean graze that would heal with minimal scarring, and his name had been cleared completely. The Pinkerton agency telegraphed their congratulations and offered him a substantial bonus for breaking the Donovan gang. 5 days after the shootout, Ruby stood on Judge Wilson's porch, watching the sunset paint the hills gold. The judge had insisted she remain his guest until things settled down, and she had gratefully accepted, unsure where else to go. The Rising Sun Saloon, though not destroyed, remained closed while repairs were made to fire damage. Higgins had left town, apparently deciding Oroville had become too dangerous for his tastes. The sound of boots on the porch steps announced Bryce's arrival. He'd been meeting with the Pinkerton representative who'd arrived that morning from San Francisco. "Beautiful evening," he said, joining her at the railing. "It is," Ruby agreed. She glanced at him sideways. "How was your meeting? Productive?" Bryce turned to face her fully. "They're pleased with the outcome. Offered me a new assignment." Ruby's heart sank, though she kept her expression neutral. Of course he would move on. That was his job, his life. The adventure they'd shared was over. "Where will you go?" she asked, striving for a casual tone. "San Francisco initially," Bryce replied. "They want me to establish a new office there. The city's growing fast, and with it, new kinds of crime that need investigating." "That sounds like a wonderful opportunity," Ruby said, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. "You'll do amazingly well there, I'm sure." Bryce studied her face for a long moment. "I turned it down." Ruby blinked in surprise. "What? Why would you do that?" "Because," he he said, taking a step closer to her. "There's something more important I need to do first." Ruby's pulse quickened. "And what's that?" "Ask you to marry me." The world seemed to stop. Ruby stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "What did you say?" Bryce took her hands in his. "I love you, Ruby Ellis. I think I've loved you since you poured me that first cup of coffee when I was half dead on the saloon floor. These past days, fighting alongside you, seeing your courage and your heart, they've only confirmed what I already knew." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "I know it's sudden. I know we've only known each other a short time. But sometimes life shows you what matters in an instant, and you'd be a fool not to grasp it with both hands." Ruby felt tears forming in her eyes. "Bryce, you don't have to answer now," he said quickly. "Take time to think. I understand this is—" "Yes," Ruby interrupted. "My answer is yes." It was Bryce's turn to look stunned. "Yes, just like that," Ruby laughed, tears spilling freely now, "just like that. Because you're right, sometimes you know in an instant what matters." She squeezed his hands. "I love you too, Bryce Quinn. I've never been more certain of anything." His smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her, their first kiss, filled with promise and certainty, and a joy so profound it made Ruby's heart ache. When they finally parted, both breathless, Bryce rested his forehead against hers. "I should tell you," he said softly, "that I did accept one offer from the Pinkertons. They're establishing a small office right here in Oroville. Seems they think the growing mining operations warrant it." Ruby's eyes widened. "You're staying here, if that's what you want," Bryce replied. "Or we could go to San Francisco together, or anywhere else you'd like. I just know I want us to be together." "Here," Ruby decided immediately. "I'd like to stay here, reclaim my father's land if possible, make a real home." She looked up at him shyly. "Our home?" Bryce's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that. Judge Wilson mentioned that the bank might be persuaded to sell back your father's property, given the circumstances. And with my Pinkerton bonus, we'd have enough to get started." They sealed this plan with another kiss, standing in the golden light of sunset on Judge Wilson's porch. Two souls who had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances. 3 months later, on a crisp October day, Ruby Ellis became Ruby Quinn in a simple ceremony at the Oroville church. Judge Wilson gave the bride away, and to Ruby's surprise, nearly the entire town attended. The newlyweds moved into the rebuilt farmhouse on her father's land. While smaller than the original, it was solid and warm, with room to grow. Bryce established his Pinkerton office in a small building in town, quickly earning a reputation for fairness and thoroughness in his investigations. Ruby, meanwhile, opened a small cafe adjacent to his office, nothing fancy. Just good food and the best coffee in the county, as her customers often declared. Those who remembered her brief tenure at the Rising Sun Saloon never mentioned it, and new arrivals to town knew her only as Mrs. Quinn, the detective's wife and an excellent cook. 1 year to the day after Bryce had staggered into the Rising Sun Saloon, he and Ruby sat on the porch of their farmhouse, watching the sunset paint the distant hills. Ruby's hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, where their first child grew. "What are you thinking about?" Bryce asked, his arm around her shoulders. Ruby smiled, leaning into his embrace. "About how much can change in a year. How sometimes the worst day of your life can lead to the best." Bryce nodded, his hand covering hers on her stomach. "I was thinking about coffee, actually." Ruby laughed. "Coffee, he confirmed with a smile, "and how a simple cup poured by the right hands can save a man's life in more ways than one." As twilight deepened around them, Ruby thought about the long journey that had led them here, from shame to honor, from loneliness to love. The road had been dangerous and uncertain, but she wouldn't change a single step. "I love you, Bryce Quinn," she whispered. "And I love you, Ruby Quinn," he replied, kissing her gently as the first stars appeared in the evening sky. In the years that followed, their family grew first with a son they named Edward after Ruby's father, then 2 years later with twin daughters who kept them perpetually busy and laughing. The Pinkerton office thrived, as did Ruby's cafe, which expanded to include a small bakery. Occasionally, Bryce would be called away on assignments that took him to Sacramento or San Francisco, but he always returned home within days, declaring that no mystery was worth prolonged separation from his family. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and they had the porch to themselves, Ruby and Bryce would sometimes reminisce about those frantic days when they first met the saloon, the escape, the shootout that had brought Blackwood's reign of terror to an end. "You know," Bryce said one such evening as they watched fireflies dance in the gathering darkness, "I never told you what I was thinking that first morning when I opened my eyes and saw you kneeling beside me with that glass of water." "What were you thinking?" Ruby asked, curious. "That I'd died and gone to heaven," he replied with a smile. "And then you brought me coffee and I knew I was still alive, because heaven couldn't possibly taste that good." Ruby laughed and swatted his arm playfully. "You're making that up." "I swear it's true," he insisted, capturing her hand and bringing it to his lips. "And every morning since, when I wake up beside you, I have the same thought all over again." Ruby leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her like a gentle tide. From saloon girl to detective's wife, from shame to respect, from loneliness to a house full of love and laughter, her life had transformed in ways she could never have imagined. And it had all begun with a simple cup of coffee, poured for a stranger in need.